The truly spiritual and consciousness-related aspirant is like a notable artist of a tender consciousness of a gentle being, full of love, knowledge, wisdom, and great sense. He has the highest sensitivity for truth, balance, beauty, and spiritual, as well as consciousness-related progress. His life is controlled, purified, and sublime, and his perspectives are very broad. His whole sense is magnanimous, and beauty expresses itself in his simple life full of high dignity. His inner peace holds a beauty which no artist can paint, and no poet can describe in words. His spiritual and consciousness-related purity has an attraction force, which can't be expressed by any music, no matter how harmonious. His security can be on an equal footing with nothing, and no end to his striving and goal can be set by any boundaries. His wisdom is an ever-present light, which shines in the deepest darkness. It is not like a light of a day, which can be overwhelmed by the darkness of the night. It is also not like the light of a great human thinker, which just always fails, often doing this right when he needs it the most. His presence is an ubiquitous outpouring of eternity, which never passes away, while the aroma of the most beautiful and most fragrant rose or orchid of the world fades away and disappears in the times of the endless. It is absolutely untrue that the human being is the measure of all things, for the measure of all things is the spirit. The human being himself is a very multi-layered being, and his various shrouds conceal other parts of his real personality. He can identify well with his coarse material physical body and can meet its needs, and he can equate himself with the conscious understanding or can feel his oneness with the real self of himself, which is the eternal, imperishable witness of both, but to create himself he cannot do. All the vital intentions, no matter how valuable they may be in their human places, cannot, in the long run, keep the being of consciousness under their enslavement or subjugate him without bringing his most inherent personality into complete disorder. In the non-creational thinking human being, the material intellect with all its given limitations takes the highest place and thereby has, as a consequence, a tremendously slow development of the spirit and the consciousness. The spiritual intellect must be developed by the consciousness quite deliberately, for it isn't enough to think that it would move by itself into higher forms. The human material intellect can only move in a vicious circle of possibilities. It always remains stuck on the surface of an object, and cannot penetrate into the same and become one with it. For without a complete identity with the object, the knowledge of it is absolutely impossible. Therefore, if a human being wants to know his fellow human beings, then he must be able to identify with these. And if a human being wants to know a matter, then he must also be able to identify with this. The material intellect accepts the testimony of the material senses and the resulting conclusions, but rejects the deepest subjective intuitions. Deep insight reveals to the human being the knowledge that there is something more in him than what his usual consciousness mediates to him. Something that is the source of all thoughts, perceptions, and feelings, a finer consciousness-related and spiritual presence, which always leaves him unsatisfied with merely material efforts. The doctrine that the usual material state of the human being is not the real and final stage of life, that he has a deeper, more penetrating life in life itself, a true self, an immortal spirit, a light that can never be extinguished by anything, has occupied the thinkers of all times and all universes across all great times over and over again. All great thinkers of all universes raise the unanimous demand over again and again to become acquainted with the real self, the life of life itself. While the bodily organism changes each moment and the thoughts surge up like gusts of wind and disappear again, the real spiritual self is never lost. It permeates absolutely everything, even though it is fundamentally different from everything, for its form is purely spiritual. It is the basic source of all perceptions, of identity through countless transformations. It takes up in any manner and form all things into itself, and yet always remains itself, unchangeable, and in the eternal symmetry of its own size. It is an invariable size within the manifold activities of the universe and the universes in general. The human restricted personality is only conscious from time to time. In between, there are large gaps in consciousness, but even when death reaches the human being, the seer and recognizer in him, the spirit, cannot die, for as a fragment of the creation, it is of eternal duration, like also the overall consciousness block. On the objective side, nothing can touch the observant subjective self. This self, existing for eternal times, which is the life of life itself, cannot be proven materially because it is of a purely spiritual form and nature, but it requires no proof for a rational being because the spirit itself is its own proof. Hence, only beings living in poverty of consciousness demand proofs for the existence of the spirit, for in their primitive thinking, they cannot recognize its existence from the spiritual acts and occurrences. The spirit itself is the basic foundation of any knowledge, processes, and the spirit itself animates every organ and every capability, and to be sure, out of the drive for development and the existence of life. The spirit, this universal self, is confused with the empirical self as a result of mental impurities. When a human being breaks through the veil surrounding his self and removes the shrouds of the material urge that restrict and cover it, he instantly acquires, in the physical body, the determination of his being. The inner spiritual being, the life of life itself, which is infinitely simple and uncomplicated, forms a unity of transcendental reality, cognition, knowledge, wisdom, love, and freedom.